They thought the skies belonged to them. For years, American pilots ruled the air with their mighty B-52 bombers, confident that nothing on Earth could reach them at 30,000 feet. They laughed at the idea that ground crews in North Vietnam, armed with clunky Soviet equipment, could ever touch the flying fortress. But that laughter died the moment a blip appeared on the radar, a Soviet missile locking on from hundreds of miles away. Within seconds, the night sky erupted in streaks of fire. Massive bombers, once symbols of invincibility, were now being hunted. For the first time, American pilots realized they were no longer the predators, but the prey. To understand how this terrifying reversal happened, we have to go back to the early days of the Vietnam War. By the mid-1960s, the United States Air Force reigned supreme in the skies of Southeast Asia. The B-52 Stratofortress, a monstrous bomber stretching nearly half the length of a football field, was the embodiment of American air power. Flying high above the clouds, these behemoths could carry 30 tons of explosives and rain destruction upon targets with devastating precision. From Washington to Saigon, it was believed that nothing, absolutely nothing, could threaten the B-52. The early air campaigns, like Operation Rolling Thunder, only reinforced that illusion. North Vietnam's anti-aircraft guns spat fire into the heavens, but their shells fell short. The lumbering bombers cruised beyond their reach, untouched and untouchable. To American pilots, the mission was routine. Take off from Guam or Thailand, unload thousands of pounds of bombs, and return home in time for dinner. It felt like a war fought from another world. But while the skies looked calm from inside the cockpit, a quiet revolution was brewing on the ground. In 1965, the Soviet Union made a fateful decision to arm its North Vietnamese allies with one of the most advanced air defense systems ever built, the S-75 Divina, known in NATO code as the SA-2 Guideline. It was the same missile that had shocked the world a few years earlier by shooting down Gary Power's U-2 spy plane over the Soviet Union. For the first time in history, a surface-to-air missile had proven it could kill at the edge of space. The North Vietnamese, determined to survive the relentless American bombing, welcomed the new technology with desperate enthusiasm. Soviet advisors arrived in secret convoys, disguised as engineers or technicians. They brought radar stations, command trucks, and crates of long, slender missiles painted white with red noses. Each one was over 30 feet long, designed to climb faster than the speed of sound, and home in on the heat and radar signature of an enemy bomber. The Americans had intelligence that new equipment was arriving in Hanoi, but few understood what it meant. Some dismissed it as propaganda. Others believed that the complex Soviet system would take years to operate effectively. After all, guiding a missile to intercept a target flying miles above the Earth was a technological ballet. Radar detection, tracking, and firing all had to align perfectly within seconds. Surely the North Vietnamese were not ready for that. But in the jungles outside Hanoi and Haiphong, something extraordinary was taking shape. Hidden under camouflage nets and fake tree lines, the first SAM sites rose from the ground like silent predators. Generators hummed in the dark, radar dishes turned slowly toward the sky, and crews drilled day and night under Soviet supervision. The launch crews were young, inexperienced, and nervous, but every day they grew more confident. Every night, the Soviet trainers whispered one message: when the Americans come, wait for the right moment. Don't shoot too early. Make it count. To the U.S. Air Force, this invisible transformation went unnoticed. Pilots still flew their bombing routes as if the sky was theirs. But by late 1966, something began to change. Radar operators aboard the bombers started picking up strange signals, long-range sweeps that didn't match any known anti-aircraft guns. Some thought it was just static interference. Others suspected something far more dangerous. The stage was set. The age of dominance was ending, and a new era of aerial warfare was about to begin. Deep in the jungles of North Vietnam, the hunters were waiting, and the B-52s had no idea that soon they would be the ones hunted. In the summer of 1966, the Soviet shipments rolled into North Vietnam under the cover of darkness. Long columns of trucks carried the pieces of a new kind of weapon: radar antennas, missile launchers, command vehicles, and the slender, deadly S-75 Dvina missiles. Soviet engineers set up the first operational batteries outside Hanoi and Haiphong, teaching their Vietnamese counterparts the intricate choreography of missile warfare. Every movement was rehearsed: the radar sweep, the tracking lock, the coded command, the ignition sequence. The North Vietnamese learned fast. They had watched their cities burn for months, their anti-aircraft guns proving useless against the high-flying B-52s. Now, for the first time, they held something that could reach beyond the clouds. To them, these Soviet missiles were not just weapons, they were hope, revenge, and survival rolled into one. Each SAM battery was a carefully constructed network. The radar operators worked from mobile cabins, scanning the skies with fan-song radars that could detect bombers over 100 kilometers away. Once a target was found, the control vehicle calculated the missile's trajectory and sent launch data to the site. Within seconds, a pair of missiles, each over 10 meters long, roared into the sky, guided by radio commands until the onboard proximity fuse detonated near the target. But this ballet of destruction required precision. One miscalculation, 1 second too early or too late, and the missile would miss entirely. The Soviets drilled the Vietnamese relentlessly, shouting orders in Russian as translators repeated them in hurried Vietnamese. Steady the signal. Lock the target. Wait for the altitude. Now, fire! Meanwhile, the Americans were growing uneasy. Reconnaissance flights began to spot strange circular clearings in the jungles, perfectly symmetrical, with 6 launch pads arranged around a central radar. They didn't know it yet, but those were SAM nests, ready to strike. The U.S. command in Saigon labeled them fan-song sites, and soon the first code word entered American vocabulary: SAM. Electronic countermeasures, or ECM teams, were rushed into action. The Americans began equipping their planes with radar jammers, chaff dispensers, and early warning receivers. Pilots were briefed on a terrifying new phrase: missile launch. Once those words were heard over the intercom, the training was simple: dive, turn, drop chaff, and pray. But adapting to the new threat was not easy. The B-52s were massive, slow to turn, and carried no defensive missiles of their own. Designed for high-altitude nuclear strikes, they were never meant to dodge incoming fire. When the SAMs appeared, the bombers were like blind whales in a sea of predators. In late 1966, the first SAM engagement took place north of Hanoi. A flight of F-105s, sent to bomb a bridge, picked up radar warnings. Suddenly, 2 white trails pierced the clouds, curving upward with impossible speed. The pilots barely had time to react before the missiles exploded among them. One jet vanished in a flash of orange fire. The rest scattered, stunned. The message was clear: the sky was no longer safe. American intelligence quickly realized what they were facing. The SA-2 Guideline was the same system that had downed the U-2 spy plane in 1960, and now it was in enemy hands. The Pentagon authorized new missions, known as Wild Weasel operations, squadrons trained to locate and destroy SAM sites. Their motto was grimly ironic: "You gotta be shitting me." Wild Weasel pilots flew into the most dangerous airspace in the world, baiting the SAMs to reveal their radar positions so accompanying jets could strike. It was a deadly game of cat and mouse. The SAM crews switched on their radars for just a few seconds, fired, and shut down again before the Americans could lock on. Every time the radar beam flickered on a cockpit display, a pilot's pulse spiked. In response, U.S. engineers developed new countermeasures: warning receivers that beeped when SAM radars locked on, pods that spewed metallic chaff to confuse guidance systems, and low-level bombing tactics to fly under radar coverage. But for the B-52s, these measures came too late. Their missions were long, predictable, and impossible to hide. The first B-52 crews sent over North Vietnam in 1967 reported seeing distant flashes from the ground. At first, they thought it was artillery fire. Then came the streaks, thin lines of flame rising straight towards them. The radar warning lights screamed. The pilots dropped chaff and banked hard, but the bomber's massive wings resisted. The missiles streaked past, exploding so close that the shockwave rattled the cockpit. One navigator later wrote in his journal, "The sky was full of fire. We were flying through a storm of death." Even when a missile missed, the psychological effect was devastating. The airmen returned to base shaking, drenched in sweat. They had seen what no bomber crew was supposed to see: death reaching them from the ground. The illusion of invincibility was shattered. Back in Washington, analysts realized the situation was spiraling. The SAM network was spreading fast. By 1968, over 30 operational sites ringed Hanoi and Haiphong like a steel shield. Each new battery made the bombing runs deadlier, each mission more desperate. To keep flying meant gambling with fate. American commanders debated how to respond. Some wanted to bomb the SAM sites relentlessly. Others argued it would take too many lives. In the meantime, Soviet freighters continued to arrive with more missiles, more radars, more instructors. The air defense grid grew tighter, deadlier, more disciplined. Every launch was a statement of defiance. For each American bomb dropped, the North Vietnamese answered with a missile streaking into the clouds. The war in the air had transformed from dominance to survival. And for the first time since World War II, American pilots whispered a word they had not spoken in decades: fear. The night was clear over North Vietnam, eerily calm, like the pause before a storm. At 30,000 feet, the roar of 8 jet engines filled the cabin of a B-52D Stratofortress as it lumbered toward its target. Inside, 6 crewmen sat in near darkness, lit only by the pale glow of their radar screens. They had done this 100 times before. Routine, mechanical, detached. Another bombing run, another wave of destruction. But tonight, something felt different. Far below, on the ground outside Hanoi, the air defense network was wide awake. Soviet technicians moved silently among the radar consoles, checking frequencies and adjusting bearings. North Vietnamese soldiers watched their screens, tense and motionless. The Fansong radar's sweeping arm cut across the night sky like a heartbeat, steady, patient, lethal. Then suddenly, it found something. A bright echo appeared on the scope, slow-moving, massive, impossible to miss. "Target confirmed," a Soviet advisor whispered in Russian. "Altitude 30,000, speed 600 knots, that's your bomber." The order went out in calm, practiced tones. Power up, set fuses, arm the missiles. In the jungle clearing, 2 white SA-2 missiles stood ready, their pointed noses angled toward the heavens. The command vehicle transmitted a short burst of data. The radar beam locked on, and deep within the launcher's core, guidance systems hummed to life. "Stand by to launch," came the final call. Then in a blinding flash, both missiles roared upward. The night exploded in thunder and light. A column of smoke split the darkness as the SAMs clawed toward the sky, leaving fiery tails that twisted and curved like serpents. Every creature in the jungle froze. The earth itself seemed to shudder. 30,000 feet above, the bomber's radar warning light turned from green to red. "Missile launch! Missile launch!" The pilot's voice cracked through the intercom. The aircraft lurched into a dive, the massive frame groaning under the strain. Chaff canisters burst open, scattering metallic strips to confuse the radar. The electronic warfare officer shouted into his headset, his voice drowned by alarms. "2 incoming, bearing 075! They're tracking us!" Outside the window, the sky was alive. Twin streaks of fire rose from the darkness below, growing brighter with terrifying speed. The navigator counted seconds under his breath. 5, 4, 3. before both missiles detonated. The explosions lit the night like twin suns, the shockwaves slamming into the bomber's fuselage. Metal shrieked. Instruments flickered. For a moment, everything went silent except the sound of tearing steel. In the command bunker, below, the radar screens flared white. The missile operators leaned forward, hearts pounding. The echo on the screen wavered, split, and vanished. One of them muttered, "Hit confirmed!" The Soviet advisor nodded slowly. "Good work," he said. "Reload." Above the clouds, the bomber was no longer a fortress. The blast had torn open its right wing. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the cabin. The co-pilot tried to stabilize, but the aircraft rolled uncontrollably. "We're hit! Engine 3's gone!" he shouted. Warning lights flashed everywhere. Smoke filled the compartment. The tail gunner called out, voice shaking, "She's breaking apart! I'm bailing!" The pilot hesitated. He could see the glowing horizon, the jungle far below, and the fires of war rising to meet them. "Everyone out! Eject! Eject!" Moments later, parachutes blossomed in the night sky. White ghosts drifting over enemy territory. The bomber, once the symbol of American air superiority, spiraled downward in a ball of flame and thunder, disappearing into the black earth of North Vietnam. That was December 1967, the first confirmed kill of a B-52 by a surface-to-air missile. Word spread fast. Across the Pacific, the U.S. bases in Guam and Thailand fell silent. Pilots gathered in briefing rooms, staring at grainy photos of wreckage. A B-52 had been shot down, not by another aircraft, but by a missile launched from the ground. The unthinkable had happened. From that day on, every mission carried a new kind of dread. The crews nicknamed the missile trails telephone poles, because that's what they looked like, huge, fiery poles rising straight toward them. When radar alarms blared, hearts froze. Veteran pilots, men who had flown in Korea and trained for nuclear war, now clutched their helmets in silent terror. The SAM operators became hunters of the sky. Each engagement refined their skill. They learned to relocate sites overnight, hiding launchers under trees or fake barns. When American bombers struck one location, the missiles simply appeared somewhere else the next day. Hanoi became a fortress surrounded by invisible teeth. For the Americans, countering the SAM threat became an obsession. The wild weasels flew ahead of the bombers, baiting the radars into revealing themselves. Their missions were suicide runs, darting low through the valleys, waiting for the radar signal to flicker on their screens. When it did, they fired anti-radiation missiles back down the beam. But the SAM crews had adapted too. They switched off the radar the moment they fired, leaving the Americans blind again. Every night became a deadly dance. SAMs fired, bombers dove, wild weasels screamed warnings across the radio. Magnum, the code word for missile away. SAM launch, the cry that made every heart skip. By 1972, during the massive Operation Linebacker II campaign, the sky over Hanoi turned into a killing ground. Hundreds of missiles streaked upward, chasing the contrails of the American bombers. The roar was constant, the light unending. Pilots described the scene as flying through fireworks made of death. The heat from explosions scorched the paint off the planes. The air smelled of burnt metal and ozone. Inside one B-52 crew compartment, Major Charles Behrens recalled, "We could see them coming, bright orange flares twisting towards us. You couldn't outfly them. You just prayed they'd miss." Some did miss. Most didn't. Within 11 days, 15 B-52s were shot down. Dozens of crewmen were killed or captured. Those who survived returned home haunted, their dreams filled with flashing lights and screaming alarms. Down below, the North Vietnamese celebrated each victory as a miracle. The missiles had turned the tide. Soviet advisors watched with pride as their technology changed the course of the war. To them, this was proof that the age of the bomber was ending, that even the giants of the sky could fall. For the Americans, the shock ran deep. The Pentagon realized it had underestimated its enemy, not the courage of the North Vietnamese, but their determination and the Soviet science behind them. The phrase "Sam Belt" became infamous, a name whispered by pilots like a curse. Every mission north of Hanoi was a flight into the jaws of death. And yet they kept flying, because that's what they were trained to do. Each night, the bombers roared into the darkness again, guided by faith, fear, and duty. They carried with them the knowledge that every launch light on the ground might be the last thing they ever saw. Up there, surrounded by streaks of fire and exploding sky, American pilots learned a bitter truth. The enemy had evolved. The age of safe bombing was over. The hunters had become the hunted. When the smoke cleared over Hanoi, the silence was deafening. The air was still thick with the stench of jet fuel and burnt metal. For the North Vietnamese, it was a triumph that few had dared to dream of. The sky, once ruled by American bombers, now belonged to the defenders. For the first time in modern warfare, the world had witnessed the fall of the giants. The loss of the B-52s sent shockwaves through the U.S. military. Each aircraft cost millions of dollars and carried a crew of 6. Every one that went down was not just a statistic, it was a symbol of American vulnerability. Back at Andersen Air Force Base in Guam, empty bunks and folded flags told the story of men who never came home. Officers walked the hangars in silence, staring at the massive bombers that still stood, wondering how many would survive the next mission. For the airmen who did return, the war had changed forever. They no longer saw the sky as their domain, but as hostile territory filled with invisible hunters. Veterans described the haunting fear that lingered after each flight, the metallic ringing in their ears, the smell of smoke that never seemed to wash off, the dreams of radar warnings and the word "Sam" echoing through their sleep. The psychological toll was immense. Flight surgeons reported growing cases of exhaustion, insomnia, and breakdowns among bomber crews. Some men refused to fly again. Others went up anyway, their faces pale, hands trembling. They called it Sam shock, a quiet terror that gnawed at the edges of discipline. Strategically, the U.S. Air Force had to rethink everything. The B-52, once designed to deliver nuclear strikes from untouchable heights, was suddenly obsolete in a world filled with radar-guided missiles. The doctrine of air superiority through altitude had collapsed. New tactics emerged: low-level bombing runs, electronic jamming, and decoy drones, all born from the lessons written in the smoke trails over Hanoi. For the North Vietnamese, the SAMs became a symbol of resistance. Each missile fired was more than a weapon. It was a declaration that even a small nation could challenge a superpower with the right allies and the right technology. The Soviet Union watched proudly as its missiles became legendary. Across the world, nations took notice. Surface-to-air systems were now the future of air defense. The age of impunity in the sky was over. In Moscow, the generals celebrated quietly. The success of the SA-2 in Vietnam proved what they had long believed, that Western air dominance could be broken. Soviet engineers began refining new generations of SAMs, faster, deadlier, and smarter. And within the Pentagon, analysts pored over every detail, determined to find a way to counter the invisible wall of missiles that had humbled their air force. Yet beyond the numbers and tactics, the legacy of those battles lay in the faces of the men who fought them. Pilots who had once felt invincible now carried a quiet respect for the enemy who fought from the ground. Many would later admit that they had underestimated the discipline and ingenuity of the North Vietnamese crews who turned Soviet technology into something far greater than its parts. By the time the war ended, the SAM had rewritten the playbook of aerial warfare. It had forced the mightiest air force on Earth to adapt, to fear, and to evolve. The B-52s that survived continued to fly for decades, but they would never again do so with the same arrogance. Every mission after Vietnam carried the ghost of those missiles, the trails of fire that had once reached up and touched the heavens. For the men who flew through that inferno, the memory never faded. The sound of the radar alarm, the flash of light, the sudden silence after impact, those moments became etched into the soul of every American pilot who faced the Soviet SAMs. It was more than a battle for the skies. It was a lesson written in fear, courage, and fire. And it changed the future of air warfare forever. In the end, the battle for the skies over Vietnam was not decided by who flew faster or who bombed harder, but by who adapted first. The Soviet SAMs had turned the heavens into a battlefield where courage alone was not enough. The mighty B-52s, symbols of American dominance, had been forced to bow to an invisible enemy that struck from the shadows of the earth. From that moment on, no pilot would ever look at the sky the same way again. Every radar blip, every flicker of light on the horizon carried a memory of the night the hunters became the hunted. Technology had caught up with arrogance, and the era of untouchable bombers was gone forever. Yet from those burning skies rose a new generation of warfare. Stealth, electronic jamming, and precision-guided strikes were born from the lessons of fear. What began as terror would become transformation, and what was once defeat became the seed of future power. Because war, in the end, is not about who falls. It's about who learns. Next time, we'll follow the story of how America struck back with Operation Linebacker 2, the most intense aerial assault since World War II. When the B-52s returned to Hanoi, not to survive, but to finish what they started.